good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today at Secular AZ. Please put your name in the chat and let us know who you are, where you're from, and why you're here today. And also be sure to switch that blue button at the bottom from host and panelists to everyone so we can all see your comments. So we're all looking for positivity these days, right? Let us know if there are any cool events in your community this weekend that we should know about. It could be about political activism, or it could just be like, this is going to make me feel good. Either way, let us know what you're doing this weekend. Here at Secular AZ, we focus on issues, not parties, but we do know which party is chomping at the bit to implement the policies laid out in Project 2025. So no doubt, Secular AZ staff, our legal director, our board of directors, we're all going to find ourselves very busy in 2025 and beyond. So today, now that your political giving has probably slowed down, I'm asking each and every one of you to consider becoming a monthly donor today, because without your support, we simply cannot do this very important work. And today, our speaker is going to give you even more reasons why you should support the work that we do. Kathleen Wellman is a Dedman Family Distinguished Professor of History at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. She is the author of La Mettrie, Medicine, Philosophy, and Enlightenment, Making Science Social, the Conferences of Théophraste Renaudot, 1633 to 1642, Queens and Mistresses of Renaissance France, and most recently, Hijacking History, How the Christian Right Teaches History and Why It Matters. While she continues to research elite women and 18th century medicine, she's also trying, admittedly in vain, to keep up with contemporary assaults on the teaching of history. Is there anything in your bio that I missed, Kathleen?
Not at all, Jean. Great introduction and perfect pronunciation.
That was my big challenge today, so I appreciate that, and I'm just going to go ahead and hand it right over to you, okay?
Okay. All right, so I would first like to thank you for inviting me to speak to Arizona Secular. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I learned from my work focusing on fundamentalist high school history curricula. Today, I'd like to give you some background to this work, describe some of its key features and the disturbing ramifications of the history they tell, and finally discuss the ways these histories raise increasingly important issues for our current culture wars and attacks on democracy. As you might be able to tell from my bio and my work in French history and early modern history of science, I never would have imagined writing Hijacking History. But every 10 years, the State Board of Education in Texas establishes standards for instruction. One crucial state standard for world history insisted that Moses was a prime influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and that Mosaic law is fundamental to our laws. Historians and others objected, but the standard was adopted. I was asked by Texas Freedom Network, an organization dedicated to the separation of church and state, to review the world history textbooks produced to conform to these standards. They had indeed emphasized Moses as the source of all of America's founding documents. They did so strongly that when a board member asked me what students might take away, I replied they might believe that Moses was the first American. I wondered where those standards had come from and how they had been accepted by the State Board of Education. The latter question had an easy answer. Most school board districts have been gerrymandered to reflect the more extreme elements of party preferences. School board elections have become hotly contested, and they attract candidates from the most extreme wings of the party. As I investigated where these ideas had come from, I became intrigued by the three most prominent Christian curricula. Abeka books published by Pensacola Christian College, Accelerated Christian Education, known as ACE, produced by an educational materials company, and the BJU curriculum published by Bob Jones University Press. These curricula have been in circulation for 50 years. They have been used to teach history to generations of students from a Christian perspective. Their reach has only increased. They have over 1 million Christian high school students in the United States, and ACE has a large international presence as well. Their market has expanded from Christian schools to homeschooling and increasingly to publicly funded voucher programs, making them even more significant than their 50-year history suggests. I could easily spend all of my time telling you about the most egregious claims these history textbooks make. I just want to focus on one of the most problematic. They all feature elements of the lost cause myth, with the idealization of the Confederacy and white Southern culture, and they downplay slavery and implicitly endorse white supremacy. One of them even praises the Ku Klux Klan as dedicated to moral improvement. I chose to study the ideas of these curricula and to place them in a historical context. My initial interest was in this work as a historian. I discovered that they reveal a remarkably consistent and coherent Christian right consensus on world history, and that view has become ever more widely held and promoted. What they do is map the history of American evangelicalism onto the history of the world. So when I worked through these curricula, I could explore the history of American evangelicalism through the First and Second Great Awakenings, through the preeminence of Protestantism in American public life in the 19th century, to the separation of evangelicals from fundamentalists in the 20th century, and the political mobilization of the religious right at the end of the 20th century. But these curricula have an explicit political role to play, especially in the curricular wars over the teaching of history. They were created to serve the so-called segregation academies of the 1970s. They subsequently appealed to parents who wanted to protect their children from the counterculture of the 1960s, and more recently from multiculturalism, globalism, or indeed America's history of racism. Their desire to maintain a reactionary account of the past serves white Christian supremacy, and that desire is increasingly shared by other educational programs. These curricula both reveal and celebrate the forging of a symbiotic relationship between conservative politicians and fundamentalist religious leaders, especially since the 1970s. Politicians used religion to repudiate social programs that might dilute their power or wealth. Religious leaders use politics to assert their vision of a Christian nation, arguing for the teaching of religion in schools and to increase their political wealth and influence. So what made these curricula worth writing a book about? I became increasingly concerned about the dangerous implications they have for our democracy. They reject religious toleration and pluralism and the separation of church and state. They urge acceptance of political leaders as God's anointed, rejecting social and political action, but ironically, simultaneously urging Christian dominion over all social institutions. Their anti-democratic implications gave me a sense of urgency about telling their history. The book I wrote moves through history from the Bible through the first Trump administration. It identifies some of the fundamental assumptions underlying the historical narrative and the historical distortions and convolutions those assumptions produce. Each chapter considers how these textbooks' claims not only defy historical consensus, but serve political and religious ends and threaten democracy. For today's talk, I wanted to isolate some of the essential presuppositions, and I suspect you'll see how problematic those ideas are and recognize their relevance for our immediate concerns. These histories all start with the Bible as the beginning of time and as the authoritative text for understanding the history of the world and the key to interpreting all human history. They lay out several fundamental positions, including New Earth creationism, the division by God of human beings into races, and God's support for limited government. The creation mandate endorses human control of the earth and Christian hegemony. Mosaic law defines the only legitimate basis for law and morality. History is the story, they say, of how God has dealt with human beings through time. It's a narrative of faith, corroborating through proof texting with the Bible. Whether a civilization accepts the one true God of the Bible, or later the biblical truth of the Protestant Reformation, determines whether these textbooks praise or blame it. For example, in the ancient world, only the Jews of the Bible pass muster. The Greeks and the Romans, long considered important contributors to the development of Western civilization, are instead atheistic humanism. They generally dismiss human history and denigrate most human accomplishments as humanism, except those that support the biblical truth, meaning those of evangelical Protestants. They tell a very surprising story about Christianity. The early Christians are featured only as martyrs. Jesus Christ is mentioned only one time in these three textbooks at all. They claim that biblical Christianity was immediately subverted by Roman Catholicism, a form of paganism, which ushered in 1,500 years of darkness illuminated only by heroic Anglo-Saxons, whom these textbooks consider proto-Protestants. They prepared the way for the Reformation and for the establishment of a Christian nation in the New World. This invocation of Anglo-Saxons is a dog whistle to white racism with historical roots in white supremacy and anti-Catholicism. Both have characterized American evangelicalism, especially Southern evangelicalism. The Anglo-Saxons are the progenitors of virtuous American Christians. For these curricula, the Reformation is a great watershed in human history. Biblical truth triumph. It underscores in these curricula that history is a series of covenants between God and his chosen people, from the biblical Jews to the earliest Christians to the English to the United States as a new Christian nation. To develop this claim, they make several arguments about the founding. The Declaration of Independence defined a Christian nation. The American Revolution was either a Christian cause or no revolution at all. The Constitution confirmed the intent of the founders to establish a Christian nation. They overlooked the fact that the Constitution itself is completely silent on religion. And their narrative rests on an understanding of the United States as the exceptional international purveyor of Christianity. In these textbooks, one can discern how God operated through time and thus determine what God has favored and what he has punished with plagues, defeat in war, or even high taxes. The 19th century offers a particularly compelling example. Victorian England set a model of the patriarchal family rooted in biblical Christianity. and God rewarded it with industrial development and capitalist expansion in its colonial ventures. Economic success is part of God's system of rewards and punishments. The ills of the working class and the poor can only be assuaged spiritually. Social and political remedies are never appropriate. Slavery is scarcely mentioned. They claim that both England and the United States enjoyed religious revivals in the 19th century, and missionaries spread Christianity throughout the world. Colonies served the interests of these Christian nations. They brought biblical truth and the blessings of capitalism, God's economic plan, to the Third World. But for these textbooks, the greatest evils are dangerous ideas. The Enlightenment's belief in reason put France on the road to revolution. Darwin is unquestionably evil, but the greatest danger was acceptance of biblical modernism as a way to interpret and understand Scripture. It was not literal, did not subscribe to inerrancy, and it relied on historical and linguistic study. Germany's adoption of the historical critical study of the Bible led directly to its destruction in World War II. Other 19th century failings include the rise of evil forms of government, all of them rooted in liberalism, socialism, fascism, and totalitarianism, and they make little distinction among them. These curricula define fundamental dichotomies: evil socialists versus godly capitalists, deplorable liberals versus admirable conservatives, wicked internationalists versus virtuous Americans. Beginning with the Cold War, history becomes the story of the identification of American evangelicals with the Republican Party. They fused religion and patriotism to oppose communism, but also rigidly connected religion and corporate capitalism to reject Democrats as New Deal socialists who undermined the nation. They condemned social welfare programs and colonial independence movements as socialist or communist. And again, God endorsed capitalism and colonialism. Their recent history details the intense politicization of the religious right in support of the Republican Party. Republican presidents are strong leaders who advance effective foreign policies and moral values. Democratic presidents are weak. Their policies undermine the status of the United States and the moral status of its citizens. These curricula judge the rest of the world on how well they conform to these ideals and support Christian missionaries and American interests. This historical narrative is virtually identical to the political activities of the developing religious right. Recent history, as they tell it, is their history. It is fiercely partisan with important ramifications for politics, religion, and the teaching of history. For its political implications, the economic and political views enshrined in biblical truth and sanctioned by God are those of the Republican Party. The Democrats have no legitimacy. There can be no foundation for a two-party system when the divide is between good and evil. Because America was founded as a Christian nation, God blesses America's foreign interventions. They are unerringly positive and beneficial to the people involved. This history also sanctifies or whitewashes its domestic history. Slavery is biblical, and both slavery and colonialism brought Christianity to Africans. They present a history of America which almost entirely expunges race and injustice, but condemns any crusade on the part of the disadvantaged as un-American. The New Deal, the labor movement, the civil rights movement are all denounced. Foreign policy warrants no criticism, and social injustice no rectification. In defining how Christian Americans should see those most unlike them, in race and religion, these textbooks foster a Christian superiority vis-a-vis other peoples and cultures. Certain that God shares their religious and political views, they erode empathy and cultivate intolerance towards others, while at the same time urging the conversion of individuals and the imposition of Christian capitalism on the world. In terms of its impact on Christianity, these textbooks implicitly promote religious intolerance. Islam is the work of the devil, and Catholics are heretics, for example. Their Christianity is less charitable than capitalist. Redresses of social ills are not the proper concern of Christians. To claim that Christianity has no social message and that Christians must not intervene in the social and economic reality God has constructed profoundly distorts Christianity. Evangelicalism has always been a religious movement with few theological precepts. In the present, evangelicalism seems almost entirely unmoored or even divorced from theology. The intellectual vacuum created, which many prominent evangelicals have bemoaned, has been filled by a politically reactionary creed. If Christianity is so tied to specific political views, those views must prevail as true, and there can be no compromise with those of other faiths or parties. These textbooks have a marked impact on the understanding of history in ways we see played out in the public arena. They conflate history with belief. It is not, therefore, subject to doubt. Whatever one believes about the age of the earth, the supremacy of Western civilization, the founding fathers, the Civil War, the New Deal, or the
There we go. Okay, good.
is impervious to counter evidence or argument. Any challenge is an assault on fundamental beliefs. Any educational material that do so are a threat. Similarly, some adults perceive any changes to the teaching of history from what they learned as children, whether to emphasize other civilization, explore other religions, or challenge American myths, or what the child learned at home or in church, as threats to the emotional well-being of their children, as we have seen in a myriad of bills passed by state legislatures to make sure no child, that is to say, no white child, is made to feel uncomfortable in history class. The teaching of history is thus increasingly couched as an attack on parental rights to control their children's education. Okay, so I think it's hard to overemphasize the relevance of these textbooks and what they claim about teaching to our current political moment. Recent developments in the ongoing culture wars make clear how widespread the dangerous ideas in these curricula have become. They are advanced completely uncritically in school board meetings, on the floors of state legislatures, in the sermons of mega churches, and the speeches of political candidates. It has become almost entirely conventional to assert the Christian nation thesis and even to proclaim Christian nationalism overtly. What do those who are promoting these ideas hope to gain, and where are these ideas deployed? Those who want to control the teaching of history to advance a Christian, politically right narrative applaud the recent decisions of the Supreme Court in undermining the separation of church and state. They appreciate its decision in Macon v. Carson, which sanctioned not only the use of public monies in religious schools, but also the teaching of explicitly religious content. And the schools that were involved in that suit were using the A. Becker curriculum. And we've seen developments in Oklahoma sanctioning religion in public schools, and Texas today authorized the use of the Bluebonnet curriculum for kindergarten through 5th grade. They understand that attacks on the teaching of history can roil culture wars to win election, as the entire nation became aware of the furor over critical race theory, which exploded in the summer of 2021. The Republican Party was looking for a cause to mobilize voters, especially suburban white voters, and Christopher Rufo, a media operative, was looking for a term that could mobilize a culture war by putting these issues in the forefront. He focused on critical race theory, which almost no one understood, but were perfectly happy to apply. And what he said about it is, we have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex it to an entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular in America. And that proved incredibly effective. The term scared white people into attaching the teaching of history and expanded to incorporate grievances on race, diversity, inclusion, immigration, and LGBTQ plus issues. Opposition to CRT led to bills constraining the teaching of history at all levels, especially about race, but also about progressive ideas, read Marxist socialist, to teaching about sexuality, read sexual grooming. Attacks expanded from the classroom to the library with bans on books emphasizing race or treating sexuality or sexual identity, and moved from the abstract to the personal with attacks on teachers, librarians, school members, school administrators, school board members. Florida has been the unedifying leader in passing education bills. One bill requires an annual survey of faculty, staff, and students at state universities about their political beliefs, with proposed budget cuts for universities against universities that supposedly indoctrinate students with woke ideas. The Stop Woke bill endorses the rights of parents to ban any books or teachings that cause discomfort about civil war, the expansion of the United States, world wars, the civil rights movement. And all of these measures are having a broader chilling effect on teaching and intellectual resistance. Some university administrators do what Timothy Schneider is warning us all not to do, is exceeding in advance. They've gone farther than the state of Florida mandated to prohibit any faculty members from testifying in voting rights cases or about mask wearing, and they have actively fostered means of constraining faculty speech. Many bills explicitly advocated some content of the Christian curricula I discussed, and some states intend to adopt standards that conform to them. Tennessee and Florida considered imposing the 1776 project initiated under Donald Trump to contest the 1619 project's insistence on the preeminence of slavery and African American culture in American history. The 1776 project excised slavery from American history and claimed that the founders opposed slavery. The current platform of President-elect Trump also urges the imposition of the 1776 project on American public schools. In sum, the outcry over CRT and the flurry of education bills produced in response demonstrates how readily the issue of teaching history taps into cultural anxiety and how effectively it can be used to advance right-wing political views. But attacking the teaching of history also contributes to the long-term intention to destroy the public schools and divert public funds to private investors. Just as the curricula I discussed allies religious and conservative political interests, so too they coalesce against public education. Campaigns to pack school boards, sue school districts, and spread book bans are funded by secret money groups that support small government economics, tax reduction, and backing conservative candidates, especially conservative judges. Wealthy donors are committed to advancing a politically conservative history and for the inclusion of a politically conservative Christian content into school curricula. Since such textbooks present conservative political views as Christian, right-wing PACs are eager to have them used in public schools. But they're even more intent on promoting alternatives to public schools. They push for voucher programs to create lucrative investment opportunities and to undermine public education. Both of these things have been long-term goals of the political right. The Christian curricula I discussed have always been part of an effort to displace public schools. With the growing expansion of voucher programs, the use of these curricula is over 90% in voucher schools in Florida, Louisiana, and North Carolina. Citizens educated with these Christian curricula in homeschooling or Christian schools will have been indoctrinated in the claims of a Republican Christian nation without a commitment to democracy. Efforts to erode public education are thus tied to empowering an autocracy and perhaps even undoing the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, which expanded democracy and fostered racial inclusion. A citizenry indoctrinated in ideas that subvert democracy will inevitably erode democracy in America, and it is no accident that authoritarian regimes inevitably attempt to control education, specifically to rewrite the histories of their countries. Such efforts are notable in Russia, Brazil, Turkey, and now even with some successes in the United States. The picture is grim, I would say, and I would urge action on the three fronts that are embodied in the central issues of these curricula. I think historians need to do a better job of recognizing Christian nationalism and writing about it and gaining a media platform for more popular works on Christian nationalism. I think it is incumbent upon Christian churches, especially churches who are discomfited by the notions of Christianity being promoted by these textbooks, to take back Christianity from fundamentalist evangelicals and to depoliticize Christianity. Because one of the threats that these curricula and these political developments pose for us is that they are increasing alienation from Christianity, pure and simple. I think that political opposition at the local level has the greatest likelihood of success. In local elections, in school board elections, there have been some successes. Indiana, for instance, thwarted a bill that was called an educational gag order against 8 divisive concepts. That bill was defeated. There have been concerted efforts to reinstate lost voting rights and preserve those that remain, and that should be a high political priority. A national commitment to campaign finance and to overturning Citizens United would be most welcome. When I began this book, I wanted to warn my fellow historians about the distorted accounts these Christian curricula promote, that they were influential and that they had shaped many of our students' understanding of history. My colleagues did not know about these histories, but things have changed dramatically for the worse. It has become completely acceptable to argue in the public sphere that America was founded as a Christian nation and must be again. Despite the separation of church and state enshrined in the Constitution, it seems entirely possible that the Supreme Court will endorse any efforts to establish Christian public schools, Christian texts and voucher programs, and even a claim of Christian nationalism. I had hoped to speak to you before the election when I thought I could inform, warn, or perhaps even motivate. Instead, in this period of post-election anxiety, with my confidence in the direction of the nation quite shaken, I remain committed to the goals of the Enlightenment figures I more usually study: to dare to know, and to the wisdom of the French philosophes who believed in the power of words to effect reform and in their ability to use media to change the common way of thinking. I think we have to hope to do the same. Thank you.
Well, thank you. We informally will dub this Friday meeting that we have as Rage Fridays, and
Okay.
you've provided us with some rage, but I do think that rage, unfortunately, is a good motivator. We certainly know it's a good motivator for the other side, and for all of us, just watching what's happening all around us, it's hard not to feel that rage. But let's get to some actual questions from our participants today. Phil is asking, is this twisted history curriculum you have described more extreme in high school texts or elementary school texts?
Okay, so all of these three major educational programs begin with first grade. And so they present the ideas that I talked about in much simplified form. So I wasn't particularly interested in the watered down version that were in the grade school textbooks, but they are from the beginning of education. So they get reinforced over and over again if you follow through the whole curriculum.
Yeah. And, we've had many, many discussions with folks who have come from very explicit evangelical upbringings. And they've talked too about, like, it starts off when you're a little kid, in a very, like, benign, not really tangible way. But then as you get further into it, girls, are called a chewed up piece of gum if they've, there's all kinds of, it's a graduated effort, I guess. I mean, just like with any other curriculum, right? Whatever kind of curriculum it is, we have the basics for our little ones, and then we get a little bit further on. So yeah. Andrew is asking, do you have any comment on the Hillsdale College curricula?
So I have looked at that. That's meant for college students. There's an awful lot of this curriculum in there, except it is more explicitly tied to radical Catholicism and to Opus Dei, and it is the people at Hillsdale are explicitly connected to the Heritage Foundation as well. So, um, yeah, I mean, it is a large movement to control how people are educated, and they're responsible for Project 1776.
And I actually subscribe to their newsletter just because, I try to subscribe to everything that I disagree with, so I know what the other side is talking about. And if you want to have a really interesting newsletter come at you every day, you can subscribe to the 1776 curriculum and see what they're trying to accomplish there. It's not good, just so y'all know. Yeah. Phil is back again, and he asks, aside from the obvious skewing of history, how much legitimate content, like specific topics, is sacrificed in these extreme curricula?
Okay, so I focused on world history, and the Bob Jones University curriculum is credible in a lot of the content unless you realize that they're forcing the content to fulfill these political and religious arguments. They have historians, university historians from Bob Jones University writing these textbooks, and so they know something about history. So they look entirely credible. One thing to realize is they also have theological specialists vetting the textbooks to make sure that they get certain things right. So somebody who read that curricula would know that there was a Reformation, that there was a Renaissance. They would know key names, key figures. They might not seem terribly poorly educated. They'd have some strange ideas. And I was astonished to find out how many I was giving a talk to the honors program at SMU, how many of our students were homeschooled with A. Becket texts or used them in evangelical schools, and then come into universities, and it's like, this is not making any sense to me. And I always knew there was something wrong with this, but I didn't know what it was. But unfortunately, since universities no longer require American history, a lot of people educated with these curricula never have any kind of corrective. The A. Becket textbook is not good history at all, and fairly simple-minded as a textbook, so it is really pushing the narrative rather than any substantive content. And the ACE curriculum is the worst. In fact, they have had lawsuits brought by their students in England because they don't have teachers. They have workbooks on topics where you read a section, take a multiple choice test, take a more comprehensive multiple choice test so you know what all the right answers are, and all the political and religious points are part of every test you take.
Yikes. I'm thinking of a school board member-elect here in the Peoria Unified School District. She is promising now that she's been elected, and they are going to have a full majority of evangelical extremists on the board, that she's going to bring the LifeWise curriculum. Are you familiar with LifeWise curriculum?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, I was just wondering. Yeah, it's I think a K-12 curriculum, and they seem to have backing from some pretty powerful organizations throughout the country. And I want to just read some comments here. There's some comments here. Oh boy, hold on just a second. When over half of Americans can't even read at the same level as their kids, I don't think they should have a say in what kids learn. Boy, oh boy, I can agree with that.
Well, that's one problem with the homeschooling movement, which has grown by leaps and bounds. There is no oversight in many states at all. So if the parents can't read, it's hard to know how they're able to teach the children, or whether anybody insists that the children actually learn anything. And to your point about the other curriculum, I think what's happened, since it's clear that there is so much money behind these moves, that there's going to be an explosion of development of these kinds of materials without any oversight whatsoever. As long as the curriculum is backed by a lot of money that can be put behind high production values that make it look as if these are really credible textbooks, I think we're going to get an incredible profusion of similar or worse educational materials for history, because teaching history seems to be so important as a means to define the political perspective of a coming generation.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is a question that you can answer in the work that you do, but the question here comes from Farrell, and they ask, have you seen resistance at the town council level or the town/council level locally?
Okay, so the textbooks get determined by the state board. There have been opposition at the local level to, okay, so one thing, and this is something that Texas schools have the option of doing. If you adopt the Prager textbook, which is basically a comic book for children, right?
Mhm.
Prager will pay your school $60 a head. And if you are a cash-strapped public school that is now being required to have someone on staff carrying a gun and to install all of these security measures, and you desperately need money, you're going to find that hard to resist.
Mhm. Yeah, our state superintendent, Tom Horn, who is just riddled with scandals and has been an elected official in the state of Arizona for probably over 20 years. He has put PragerU on our state's Department of Education website and encouraging districts to use it. He's the same guy who's using taxpayer dollars to promote the private school voucher scam, the grift. So we're pretty familiar with PragerU out here, and it's terrible propaganda. Like, I personally feel like right now we are in a war against propaganda, plain and simple, because these
Yeah, and one thing,
children.
yeah, and one thing Prager has that the grade school curricula do for these Christian textbooks is incredibly overt and raging misogynism. Because from kindergarten, girls are told in these textbooks, girls are told they must wear dresses, they must be feminine, they must take care of the house. That's their job.
Hmm. Okay, here's a good question that maybe I hope you can answer. If you could wave a magic wand and have a group of volunteers willing to go into public spaces like school board meetings, city hall, etc., and push back against the funded effort the extremists have made in such venues, what would you love to see people trained to speak to or emphasize?
Okay, so I think the two areas that you would want people trained to speak would be science and history.
Mhm.
And so, one place that a number of my colleagues and I have done this is to testify before the State Board of Education. Unfortunately, you are only allowed to speak for 3 minutes. There ought to be venues where, all right, so another thing is you have to have state government institutions willing to accept some forms of expertise. I don't know if I have a magic wand that can do that, right? So I offered to review textbooks before they were produced. So I listed my credentials. I was chair of the history department at SMU, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, a car salesman was chosen to vet textbooks instead of me because he had the right political credentials. So, yeah, my magic wand. I would like to see. I would like to see professional organizations of both historians and scientists mobilized, but scientists depend entirely on government contracts for their careers and they feel vulnerable. Other academics in state institutions are facing a lot of opposition, and so it's a difficult ask.
It's so true because here in Arizona, 2 years ago, we had a certified teacher, speech pathologist as our superintendent of public schools, and she got beat by the guy that I mentioned before, riddled with scandal, DUI, the hit and run. I mean, it doesn't matter. And the same has happened throughout school board races throughout the state. Actual teachers, award-winning teachers. Our 2016 Teacher of the Year, Christine Marsh, who's been now in the Senate for 2 terms, lost. And it's just mind-boggling to see who's replacing them. I feel like most of the time here in Arizona, we've got a lot of real estate agents who run for office. Um, and if you're a professional, if you're knowledgeable in your field, well, you don't like there's a massive distrust of anybody who has any kind of, expertise in their field because now I guess the internet or whatever has deemed everybody an expert in whatever field they think they're experts in. It's maddening. Here's a question from Karen from the Q&A. What percentage of the American population professes to be Christian of any stripe? I remember reading years ago that religious attachment was shrinking.
Oh, gee, I can't remember the latest statistic, but religious attachment is dramatically shrinking. And I think people who are agnostic now are a larger majority of the population than people professing Christianity. And those who profess Christianity no longer are much associated with mainline Protestant denominations. They profess to be evangelical, often without any adherence to any particular church or any church at all. They're just Christian.
Yeah, for sure. And least like Christians I've ever seen in my life. All right. What will be the future of teachers? This is from Mark. A spokesman for Hillsdale denigrated teachers with actual teaching degrees.
Uh, Once again, it comes down to the attack on professionalism, right? I mean, Texas was going to hire anyone who had been in the military to be a teacher in the public schools with no credentials, no experience, and no vetting to fill
Yeah.
vacancies. So it's sort of like anyone can do it, apparently. And so I don't know what the future of teaching will be.
What I do know, here in the state of Arizona, there are reports of anywhere between 35 to 50,000 teachers with valid certificates like myself who will not teach anymore because, I mean, here in Gilbert, Arizona, in a school district called Higley, we've got a teacher right now who's under police investigation because she assigned books like The Kite Runner and The Bluest Eye to her AP students because
Wow.
it is advanced placement. So, you know, when things like that happen to an award-winning teacher, you're not really motivated to stay in a classroom where you're not going to be respected and in some cases even be attacked.
Right. And you're never going to be paid particularly well either. So,
No, no. Okay, another question coming. I think this is a question from Ron. Public education was once a way to bring disparate groups together, learning a common curriculum. Won't Arizona's ESAs? Yes, Ron, the ESAs will work against that. So yes, absolutely. Because with ESAs, and if you can take that money and homeschool, you can homeschool that the only reading instruction that you need to give a child is simply so that they can read the Bible, right? Like you can stop at a 5th grade reading level. There's not going to be, any kind of compare and contrast or persuasive arguments about the text that you read. It's more about like, can you regurgitate the words? So yeah, the ESAs definitely work against that. Also, teaching media literacy and critical thinking is a key in democracy. And that's really interesting that you say that, Ron, because here in Arizona, one of our staunchest supporters of secular, ideology, Juan Mendez, lost his primary and he wanted a media literacy and critical thinking bill like that he wanted to get in front. It didn't even make it out of committee. So that's the other thing. Like, it's pretty clear that they're afraid of actual knowledge getting into the hands of these children, right?
they also, and this is part of the sort of brief on education in Project 2025, and it's also part of the Trump platform. There is a prohibition on the teaching of civics. Because if you teach civics, you know how government's supposed to work and you know about the branches of government, and no civics education.
Yeah, and here in Arizona, I don't remember exactly when it happened, but Doug Ducey signed a bill that was about that every high school student had to pass the civics exam that like all immigrants have to pass. And that's great and everything, but it was such an empty thing. So when it actually like there was a bill, I don't know if it was this past session or a year before that, but a bill that that was put forth by the GOP about teaching about communism. And the Democrats actually got together and said, great, we love that, but let's also teach about fascism. And they wanted to add an amendment to the bill, and they said no. So it's like you only get to teach about the isms. The controlling party gets to decide which isms, and they get to decide exactly, it seems, the definition of those isms and how it's to be taught in our public classrooms.
Right.
Ugh. Okay, this really is a Rage Friday. And yeah, I got into education back in 2008, and I was just a baby teacher back then. And I said, their goal here is to privatize public education. It's
Yep.
pretty clear to me. And there have been many of us in the world of public education coming together to scream that from the mountaintops. But it seems that a lot of people are on board with the privatization of public education. Can you explain why? Or, I mean, I don't even, you can't explain this. How do working class people decide that this is the best avenue for teaching their children?
Okay, so one of the very sobering things is that the voucher movement began in the South, and it is a move to resegregate the schools. And so the Mississippi schools are essentially public school minority, private school whites supported by vouchers. And that's what will happen. But the other thing is, public education is the last large pot of cash that private enterprise has not gotten its hands on. And they've wanted to do this. I mean, Milton Friedman laid this out in the 50s as a goal for the Republican Party to gain control of public monies going to public schools so they could be used as vehicles of private investment. And that's part of it, because if you fund a voucher, you get a direct tax write off in that amount. So it's, if you're really wealthy, it's a really useful investment tool for you. And then you also get your views promulgated. So sort of a double win.
Well, and we've experienced that here with our state legislature, with the likes of a guy named Eddie Farnsworth, who's long since retired, but made I don't know how many millions of dollars off of these charter schools, failing charter schools, by the way. And the other guy, Steve Yarborough, who also helped push through the charter school privatization movement, made tons of money, and then was just able to dip out and enjoy his life. Like, yeah, it's well, I feel like every Friday, Rage Friday, we end up at the same kind of place, that unfettered capitalism is the root of all evil. And like you just said, if there is money to be made, somebody is going to stick their little sticky fingers into it. So, whew.
Which would, it's why I think, I mean, I worried the minute Citizens United was passed that we were headed for oligarchy. And that's pretty clearly the case when, Peter Thiel can buy J.D. Vance's Senate seat, pure and
Mhm.
simple, right? And so we need to get, if we get money out of politics, people with money will be less interested in affecting it, is my view.
Yes, indeed. And that's going to be a tall order considering all the fronts that we are currently now seeing ourselves battling. So, with all of that, um, we do try to give people hope on this Rage Friday. So, what is it, Kathleen, that gives you hope in these dark times?
Well, like I said, I think words matter. I think people who are dedicated to reading and writing and speaking can have an impact, and a movement that is dedicated to changing the ordinary way people think. I think one thing that has been clear is that the right wing is really good at getting everyone to rally around some concept, whether they understand it or not, and using it as a wedge into all of the anxieties that people have. And I think that people who oppose them have to figure out what kinds of words would mobilize people to work progressively and positively out of motives other than fear.
All right. So, strong communication, using information over fear and over playing with people's emotions. Um, well, really good conversation, a little bit depressing conversation, Professor, but we appreciate you so much here in Arizona for doing the work that you do up there in North Texas. So thank you so much for joining
You're
us
welcome
today.
and happy to be here. Nice to see
Thanks
you
so
all.
much. Appreciate you. Appreciate everybody's here, and we'll see you next week, everybody. Have a great
Bye.
weekend. Take care.